My name is Morgan Kelly. I'm 42 years old, and for the last 15 years, I've served as a captain with the Miami-Dade Fire Rescue. You get used to the adrenaline. It becomes a secondary pulse, a low hum in your ears that tells you you're alive. But on July 14th, 2025, that hum turned into a scream. We were answering a third alarm call at a commercial warehouse near the port. The humidity that morning was already sitting at 94%, the kind of thick, salty air that makes your turnout gear feel like it's lined with lead before you even step off the rig. I remember looking at my crew, good men, younger than me, faces smeared with soot and sweat, and feeling that brief, flickering pride of leadership. I have footage from that morning on my helmet cam. You can see me standing next to the primary feeder line, the orange glow of the interior structure fire reflecting off my visor. The heat was radiant, pushing 800 degrees Fahrenheit at the ceiling. I was directing the vent team, my voice cracking over the radio, when the world suddenly narrowed. It wasn't a flashover or a structural collapse. It was a silent, internal betrayal. I felt a sharp, serrated pressure behind my sternum, not the dull ache of overexertion, but something precise and cold. My vision, I was just a point of awareness, suspended in a void that smelled faintly of ozone and old, cold ash. The heat was gone. The noise was gone. I was clinically dead before my brothers even reached my side. The transition back to consciousness wasn't a return to my body, but a shift in perspective. I was hovering near the ceiling of Bayfront Health's trauma center. I could see the frantic, rhythmic chaos of a code blue. There I was, or rather, there was the shell of me. Morgan, 42, Caucasian male, unresponsive. My turnout coat had been sheared off with trauma shears, lying in a heap of yellow Kevlar and reflective tape in the corner. I watched a young resident, her brow furrowed in a way that suggested she was losing the fight, perform chest compressions. The terminology was clinical and sharp, V-fib, charging to 200. Clear. I watched my own body jerk upward as the current ripped through me. I felt nothing, but I saw everything. I saw the way my skin had turned a waxy, translucent gray, the way my wedding ring caught the harsh fluorescent light as my hand flopped off the side of the gurney. Then I saw her. My wife, Sarah, was standing behind the glass of the observation window. I have videos of us from our last anniversary, laughing on the beach, her head thrown back, my arm around her, just a man and a woman who thought they had 40 more years of mundane Tuesdays. Now, she was a ghost of herself, her hands pressed so hard against the glass that her knuckles were white. She wasn't praying, she was pleading with the air. Seeing her like that, seeing the raw, jagged edge of her grief, hurt more than the heart attack. It was a personal fracture, a realization that my heroic job had finally exacted the price I always promised her I wouldn't have to pay. I tried to reach out, to tell her that the me on the table was just a suit I was done wearing, but the room began to stretch. The hospital walls didn't disappear, they just became irrelevant. I was pulled backward, through the layers of the building, through the clouds, and into a space that felt older than the earth itself. The medical monitors, the smell of antiseptic, and Sarah's sobbing face faded, replaced by a presence that felt like a mountain standing in front of a candle. I wasn't in a tunnel. I was in a corridor of truth, and for the first time in my life, I felt the absolute weight of 2026 pressing down on the soul of the world. It wasn't a year, it was a threshold. The transition from the sterile, frantic energy of the trauma bay to where I stood next was not a travel through space, but a sudden adjustment of the soul's frequency. I wasn't in a garden or a cloud. I was standing in what looked like the charred remains of a sanctuary. A place that felt like every church I'd ever stepped into for a wedding or a funeral, yet stripped of its pretension. The pews were weathered, the floor was simple stone, and the air didn't smell like incense. It smelled like the ozone after a lightning strike. Then he was there. I didn't see a flash of light or hear a trumpet. I simply turned, and he was standing by a heavy wooden table, looking at me with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of every fire I'd ever fought. He wasn't the stained glass version. He looked like a man who knew what it was to work with his hands, wearing a simple, dark tunic that looked almost like a technician's uniform. There was an intense, grounding gravity to him. He looked at me, Morgan Kelly, and I felt my entire life, Every lie I'd told to Sarah about being fine after a rough shift, every moment of pride I'd swallowed, laid out like a map. "Morgan," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it vibrated in my marrow. It was the voice of a commander who already knew the outcome of the battle. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell me it was my time or wasn't my time. He walked toward me, and as he did, the walls of the sanctuary began to flicker like a failing monitor. Images of the world I had just left started to bleed through the stone. I saw the footage of myself from only months ago, the man in the turnout gear, laughing with my crew, leaning against the engine. I looked so young in those videos, so sure that the world would always keep turning on its axis of scheduled shifts and weekend barbecues. "The fire you fight is physical," he said, his hand resting on the table. "But the fire coming is a refinement of the spirit. You are here because you need to see the threshold of 2026. It is not an ending, Morgan. It is a separation." He looked at the flickering images of my life. The footage of me hugging Sarah at the firehouse Christmas party, the two of us, just two people in a sea of uniforms. Everything you think is solid is about to become fluid. The structures you trust are already beginning to melt. The weight of his gaze made my chest ache in a way the heart attack hadn't. It was the weight of a warning that had no room for negotiation. He moved his hand, and the air between us didn't just show a vision, it became a window. I wasn't looking at a symbolic apocalypse. I was looking at a Tuesday morning in a city I recognized. It was a high-end grocery store, the kind with polished floors and rows of organic produce. Everything looked normal, but the tension was a physical pressure, like the atmosphere right before a backdraft. I saw people moving through the aisles, but their eyes were darting, their movements jagged. "This is the first event," he said. "The great devaluation of trust." I watched a woman at the checkout counter. She was trying to pay with a digital app on her phone. The screen flashed red. She tried again, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Behind her, the line began to mutter. It wasn't just a technical glitch. I could feel the collective realization in the room. The digital tether that held their lives together had frayed. "In 2026, he explained, the systems that manage the daily bread will demand a signature of allegiance that many will find impossible to give. It starts with the currency, but it ends with the soul." I saw the woman's face, a mother, maybe my age, and the way her hand trembled as she looked at her children. This wasn't a famine of grain, it was a famine of access. The woman walked out without her bags, her head down, avoiding eye contact with the security guard who stood by the door with a hand on his belt. The social contract was breaking in real time. "The world will tell you it is for your safety," Jesus said, his voice hardening slightly. "They will say the chaos requires a new order, but the order is a cage." I felt a cold shiver go through my spirit. I thought of my own bank app, my pension, the security I had worked 15 years to build for Sarah. It felt like ash. I realized then that the firefighter in me wanted to run into that grocery store and fix it, to give that woman my card, to stabilize the scene. But as I watched, I saw the store's lights flicker and dim, and the people inside didn't help each other. They clutched their own belongings tighter. They looked at their neighbors not as fellow citizens, but as competitors for a dwindling resource. "What changes?" I asked, my voice sounding small in that massive presence. "The definition of neighbor," he replied. "In 2026, the border isn't at the edge of the country. It's at the threshold of your front door. The outcome for every man and woman will be determined by one thing. Have you placed your life in the system of man or in the hand of the Father? You cannot hold both when the shaking begins." The grocery store faded, replaced not by another vision of the world, but by the interior of my own home. I was standing in my kitchen in Pembroke Pines. The lighting was gray, that flat, depressing hue of a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I saw Sarah. She wasn't crying anymore. She was sitting at the small mahogany desk where we keep the laptop and the stack of important mail. She looked older. Not by years, but by the kind of stress that carves lines into your face overnight. "This is the second event," he said, his voice a low resonance behind me. "The severing of the inner circle." I watched as Sarah stared at the screen of our joint bank account. I saw her hand hover over the mouse, then retreat. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. I knew who it was before she even spoke. Her sister, Elena. They were inseparable, the kind of sisters who finished each other's sentences. But as the call connected, Sarah's face didn't soften. It hardened into a mask of cold, clinical desperation. "I can't do it, Elena," Sarah whispered into the phone. "The new compliance filing. If we don't sign the digital attestation, Morgan's pension is frozen. They're already flagging his medical discharge because of the irregularity of his collapse. They're calling it a pre-existing cognitive refusal." I watched as she listened to the response. I couldn't hear Elena, but I saw the moment the bond broke. Sarah's eyes filled with a sudden, sharp betrayal. She pulled the phone away from her ear as if it had turned into a viper. "You did it? Without telling me?" Sarah's voice cracked. "You signed onto the registry just to keep your travel clearance?" She hung up without saying goodbye. She sat there in the silence of our kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Jesus stepped closer to the image, his gaze fixed on my wife's trembling hands. "The second event is the weaponization of affection," he said. "In 2026, the pressure to conform will not come from a boot on a neck, but from the voices of those you love. They will beg you to compromise so that they can feel safe. This is the personal fracture, Morgan. The choice between the truth I have given you and the peace of your own home." The scene shifted violently. We were no longer in my kitchen, but standing on the steps of a massive, brutalist building, the regional headquarters of a major federal agency. The air felt heavy, metallic, and cold. People were streaming out of the glass doors, carrying cardboard boxes. These weren't victims of a layoff. These were people with looks of profound, hollowed-out fear. I saw men in suits and women in uniforms, the very people who run the machinery of our society, looking over their shoulders as if they were being hunted. "The third event," he murmured, "is the falling of the pillars." I watched a man I recognized, a high-ranking official I'd seen on the local news a dozen times, trip on the stairs. His files spilled out, spreadsheets, internal memos with red headers, maps of power grids. No one helped him. They stepped over his documents like they were trash. "In 2026, Jesus explained, the institutions that held the illusion of order, the courts, the agencies, the grand bureaucracies, will cannibalize themselves from within. The experts will vanish and the leaders will hide. What remains will be a vacuum of authority that a darker power will rush to fill." I looked at the chaos on the steps. It was an institutional cardiac arrest. As a firefighter, I knew that when the command structure fails, people die. I saw a line of police cruisers idling at the curb, their lights flashing, but the officers inside weren't moving. They were staring at their dashboard terminals, waiting for orders that weren't coming because the servers were dark. The grid of human trust had hit zero. "Who was affected?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Everyone who built their house on the sand of human expertise," he said. He turned to me, and the sanctuary around us reappeared, more solid than the world I had just witnessed. "The outcome is determined by your foundation. When the pillars fall, Morgan, only those who are leaning on the unshakable will remain standing. You saw your wife struggle. You saw the city panic. 2026 is the year the mask of the world is stripped away to reveal the void beneath. You must choose now. Will you return to warn them, knowing they will call you a madman, or will you stay here in the peace?" The sanctuary began to vibrate, not with a sound, but with a frequency that felt like it was pulling the atoms of my spirit apart. Jesus didn't move, but the space around him darkened until the only thing visible was his face and the glowing, jagged edges of the window into our world. He gestured one last time, and I saw the fourth event. It wasn't a riot or a bank failure. It was a silence. A profound, artificial quiet that covered the entire map of the United States. "The fourth event," he whispered, and the gravity of his words made the stone floor beneath me feel like water. "The great partition of the spirit." I saw a map of the country, but it wasn't divided by state lines or political red and blue. It was divided by a pulsing, bioluminescent light. Some homes glowed with a steady, warm amber. Others were encased in a cold, flickering violet, a digital shroud. "In 2026, he explained, the technology of man will attempt to bridge the gap between the biological and the artificial. They will offer a correction for the chaos you just saw, a way to sync the mind to the system to ensure peace. But those who take the tether will lose the frequency of the Father." I saw people I knew from the fire station, men I'd bled with, sitting in their living rooms, staring at screens with eyes that were vacant, perfectly compliant, and utterly hollow. They were safe. They had food. Their bank apps were green. But when they looked at their children, there was no recognition of the divine spark. They had become nodes in a network. This is what determines the outcome, Morgan, Jesus said, stepping so close I could feel the heat of his breath. The choice is between a provided survival and a holy risk. 2026 is the year the middle ground is burned away. You cannot hide in the gray anymore. You are either in the light or you are part of the machine. The vision of the glowing map collapsed, and suddenly I was no longer an observer. I was standing back in that cold, gray version of my own kitchen, but this time, Jesus was standing there with me, next to the refrigerator where Sarah's grocery list was still pinned with a magnet. The contrast was physically painful. The King of Kings standing next to a half-empty carton of milk and a stack of unpaid bills. This was the midpoint, the moment where the prophecy became a debt I had to personally collect. "Morgan," he said, and for the first time, his voice carried a trace of human sorrow. "If you go back, you will lose the life you spent 42 years building. Your captaincy? Gone. They will label your vision as a neurological event caused by hypoxia. Your pension? It will be the first thing they seize when you refuse the 2026 attestation. And Sarah?" He looked at my wife, who was still sitting at the desk, oblivious to our presence. "She will look at you not as a hero, but as the man who is destroying her security. To tell the truth is to invite the fire into your own house." I looked at Sarah. I remembered the footage of us laughing, the way she used to tuck her head under my chin after a long shift. If I went back and kept my mouth shut, I could have that back. I could take the correction when it came in 2026, keep my head down, and protect her. But then I looked at the vacancy in the eyes of the people in the vision, the hollowed-out, safe people. I realized that protecting her by lying would be the ultimate betrayal. I was a firefighter. My entire life was about running into the places everyone else was running out of. "I can't let them go into that fire blind," I said, my voice cracking. I reached out to touch Sarah's shoulder, but my hand passed through her like smoke. The realization hit me with the weight of a collapsing roof. I was dead. I was currently a corpse on a stainless steel table, and the only way to save her was to return to a world that was about to reject me. Jesus nodded, a slow, solemn movement. "The choice is yours, Captain. Return to the smoke, or stay in the light. But know this, if you go, the mark of this place will never leave you. You will be a stranger in your own home." The weight of his gaze was more suffocating than any smoke-logged hallway I'd ever crawled through. I looked at the vision of my wife again, Sarah, sitting at that mahogany desk, her thumb nervously tracing the edge of a credit card. She looked so fragile in her pursuit of a normal that no longer existed. If I stayed here, in this sanctuary of ozone and peace, I would never have to see her heart break. I wouldn't have to watch the world I'd sworn to protect turn into a digital cage. I could just stop. "If I go back," I whispered, my voice thick with a grief that felt physical, "she won't understand. She'll think I've lost my mind. She'll think the hypoxia fried my brain." I thought of the footage on my phone, the videos of us at the firehouse barbecue, the way my crew looked at me with a respect I'd spent 15 years earning. To return meant to trade that respect for a scarlet letter. It meant being the man who stands at the grocery store entrance and tells people not to scan their palms, the man who tells his sister-in-law that her safety is a lie. Jesus didn't offer a reassuring pat on the shoulder. He didn't tell me it would be easy or that Sarah would eventually see the light. He stood there with the raw, uncompromising stillness of a mountain. "The truth is not a comfort, Morgan. It is a fire. It destroys everything that cannot endure it." He looked toward the hospital room where my body lay, cold and gray. The 2026 threshold is not for the faint. It is for those who would rather lose the world than lose their place in the kingdom. You are a captain. Do you lead your people into the truth, or do you let them burn in the illusion? I took a breath, a soul's version of a breath. I thought of the woman in the grocery store and the vacancy in the eyes of my fellow firefighters. I couldn't unsee the flickering violet shroud. I couldn't let them walk into that trap without at least one voice screaming, "Get out," from the rooftop. "I'm going back," I said. The moment the words left my mouth, the sanctuary didn't dissolve. it exploded into a blinding, pressurized whiteness. The peace was replaced by a sudden, violent sensation of being pulled through a straw. The transition back into my body felt like being hit by a freight train. There was no drifting into the flesh. It was a jagged, agonizing reentry. My lungs, which had been still for over 6 minutes, suddenly spasmed. I felt the cold, hard plastic of an intubation tube shoved down my throat, scraping against my larynx. My ribs screamed. A sharp, localized agony that told me the compressions had been successful enough to crack the bone. "We have a rhythm. He's back. Captain Kelly is back." The voices were too loud, echoing like they were inside a tin can. I opened my eyes, but the fluorescent lights of the trauma bay felt like needles being driven into my retinas. I saw the young resident, the one I'd watched from the ceiling, her face splattered with my own sweat and a drop of blood. She looked exhausted, her blue scrubs darkened with the effort of bringing me back. But as I looked at her, I didn't just see a doctor. I saw the violet flicker at the edge of her vision. I saw the system she was already part of. I tried to speak, to tell them what I'd seen, but the tube in my throat turned my warning into a wet, guttural choke. My hands, still weak, flailed against the restraints on the gurney. I saw Sarah's face through the window. She was sobbing, her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and relief. She thought the nightmare was over. She thought the miracle had happened. She didn't know that for me. The real fire was just beginning. As they wheeled me toward the ICU, the monitors beeping in a rhythmic, taunting cadence, I looked at the digital clock on the wall. The red numbers blurred for a second, then snapped into focus. It was July 14th, 2025. I had exactly 5.5 months before the first seal of 2026 would be broken. I lay there, trapped in a body that felt like a prison, watching the nurses check my 4 drips and scan my wristband. Every beep of the machine felt like a countdown. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't escape the image of that grocery store, the red screen, the rejected mother, and the silence that was coming for us all. Recovery wasn't the triumphant return the department expected. They gave me a medal for valor in the line of duty, but every time I looked at it, I saw the waxy, gray skin of the man I had been on that table. I was back in our apartment in Pembroke Pines, sitting on the balcony overlooking the palm trees, but I felt like a deep-sea diver suffering from the bends. Everything felt thin. Sarah would come in with a cup of coffee, smiling that cautious, fragile smile, and I would see the grocery store vision layered over our living room. I was processing the world through a double exposure. The first glitch happened 3 weeks after I was discharged. I was sitting in the recliner, scrolling through the news on my phone, habitual, restless, when a headline from a local business journal caught my eye. It was a small piece about a pilot program for biometric transaction security being fast-tracked in 3 Florida counties. My heart did that familiar, stuttering skip. The article mentioned a partnership between a major tech conglomerate and the federal treasury to stabilize regional supply chains against digital volatility. It was the exact language Jesus had used. I called my captain, Miller, a guy I'd known for a decade. I tried to sound casual. "Hey, you hear anything about the new payroll compliance for next year? Something about a digital attestation?" There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear the background noise of the station. The clinking of silverware in the kitchen, the low mumble of the TV. "Morgan," Miller said, his voice dropping to a tone I'd never heard from him. It wasn't friendly, it was guarded. "How do you know about that? That's still in the internal legal review for the union. We haven't even briefed the shift leads yet." I felt a cold sweat prickle my neck. The great devaluation of trust was already leaking into the plumbing of my own life. Miller didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't ask about my heart. He just told me to stay off the internal servers until my medical clearance was fully processed. When I hung up, I looked at Sarah. She was watching me from the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed, her eyes filled with that terrifying, silent withdrawal. She knew I was chasing something, and she was already beginning to mourn the man she thought she got back. By December 2025, the air in Miami felt electric, but not with the usual holiday energy. There was a frantic, jagged edge to the city. I was officially on leave, which was the department's polite way of sidelined. The irreversible event happened on a Tuesday, the same day of the week I had seen in the vision. I walked into the Publix on Flamingo Road to pick up a few things. It was a mundane task, one I'd done 1,000 times, but as I stepped through the automatic doors, the smell of the place hit me. It wasn't the smell of bread or floor cleaner. It was the smell of the ozone from the sanctuary. I walked toward the back, toward the pharmacy, and there it was. A new kiosk had been installed overnight. It was sleek, white, and featured a glowing violet sensor. A small line of people had already formed. They weren't being forced. They were being offered a $500 credit to link their health and financial profiles for a seamless 2026 transition. I watched an elderly man, someone's grandfather, lean forward and scan his hand. The screen flashed a soft, welcoming green. I felt a hand on my arm. It was Sarah. She had followed me into the store, her face pale. "Morgan, we have to do it," she whispered. Her voice was flat, devoid of the warmth I had lived for. "I got the email from the insurance company this morning. If we don't link by January 1st, they're canceling the coverage for your heart medication. It's $1,200 a month out of pocket. We don't have it." I looked at the violet glow of the sensor, then back at my wife. This was the weaponization of affection I had been warned about. This was the personal fracture. I could see the system closing its teeth around us, a perfect, logical trap. If I said no, I was hurting her. If I said yes, I was stepping into the shroud. I looked down at my hand, the same hand that had held the feeder line in the fire, the same hand that had flopped off the gurney in the trauma bay. It was shaking. I didn't give her an answer. I couldn't. I just turned and walked out of the store, leaving the cart where it stood. I walked into the bright, blinding Florida sun, the heat of the asphalt radiating through my shoes. Behind me, I heard the electronic chirp of the kiosk as the next person in line scanned their life away. It was the same pitch as my past device in the fire. I stood in the parking lot, a captain without a crew, a husband without a home, watching the palm trees sway in a wind that felt like a closing door. I'm still here. I'm still waiting. But the silence I saw in the vision, the great, artificial quiet, is finally starting to settle over the neighborhood. If this message felt important, it probably was. There are more stories like this, and they only get deeper. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next one, because some warnings aren't meant to be ignored.